A military parade meant to honor the troops turned into Adam Schiff's worst nightmare. In front of the cameras, Trump scored a massive win, and Schiff was left humiliated. But what happened at the end? No one saw that coming. Stick around. The final twist changes everything. No one expected a military parade to spark a political earthquake, but that's exactly what happened on a crisp, cloudless morning in Washington, D.C. The streets were packed, thousands deep, with Americans from every background. Veterans in uniform, families holding flags, children on shoulders. It was meant to be a simple show of strength, a celebration of service. But by noon it had turned into something far more dangerous. A national turning point that would leave Congressman Adam Schiff humiliated in front of the people he once claimed to represent. The parade had been Trump's idea. Revived after years of being dismissed as wasteful or overly dramatic, this one had a new tone. It was precise, focused. There was no pageantry for the sake of it. Every marching unit, every vehicle, every salute had a purpose. Even Trump's fiercest critics quietly admitted something about it felt different, more strategic, more intentional, more personal. Trump stood on the central viewing platform, flanked by former generals and top defense officials, many of whom had remained loyal to him even after his presidency. But what caught the crowd's attention and sent a chill across political circles was who marched next. Halfway through the parade, after the Marine Corps had passed and the Air Force flyover faded into the sky, a formation of soldiers emerged that few in the crowd expected to see. The 3rd Recon Tactical, a highly specialized combat unit that had been decommissioned and nearly defunded years earlier after heavy scrutiny by Adam Schiff's Intelligence Committee. At the time, Schiff had accused the unit of being part of Trump's militarization agenda, suggesting their tactics were excessive and their budget unjustified. But today, the 3rd Recon was not only back. They were leading the most thunderous applause of the day. Wearing restored insignia and marching with flawless synchronization, they carried not just rifles, but banners bearing the names of fallen soldiers who once served in their ranks. Behind them walked widows and children of the lost, a silent tribute that spoke louder than any speech could. A hush fell over the crowd at first, then a growing roar. People rose to their feet. Some wept. Some simply stared in disbelief. These were not faceless troops. They were stories, faces, lives, and their presence on that parade route, sanctioned by Trump and cheered by thousands, hit like an emotional sledgehammer. Television anchors scrambled to contextualize what was happening, but the reaction was visceral and immediate. "That's Schiff's Achilles heel," one veteran commentator whispered live on air. "Those are the soldiers he tried to erase." And then the camera cut to Schiff. Somewhere across town, watching the parade from a government building, Adam Schiff sat with a tight jaw and wide eyes. The image of the 3rd Recon's flag passed across the screen, and something in him visibly broke. His mouth tensed, his eyes flicked downward. For a moment, he looked less like a political operator and more like a man watching his legacy unravel in real time. Social media exploded within minutes. Trump just buried Schiff with a parade. That wasn't just military pride, that was political warfare. Hashtags like #Recon returns and Schiff silenced began trending globally. What was meant to be a ceremonial event had turned into a calculated demonstration of who still held the power to shape the national story. But even that wasn't the most devastating part. It was what followed, the stories, the testimonials, the emotions, that turned this from a win into a complete emotional triumph for Trump and a brutal personal defeat for Adam Schiff. And in that single hour, with drums pounding, flags flying, and hearts swelling across the country, Adam Schiff learned what it meant to lose not in a vote, but in the hearts of the people he thought he understood. Years before the parade that would shake the nation, Adam Schiff stood tall in a Capitol Hill hearing room, surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. Calm, measured, and seemingly in control, he sat as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, determined to root out what he called the abuses of executive power that had, in his view, defined Donald Trump's presidency. That day, Schiff was not talking about Russia or phone calls with foreign leaders. He was talking about the military, specifically a budgetary review that targeted what he described as overreach in military spending, focusing especially on elite tactical units that operated with high autonomy and aggressive strike capabilities. The 3rd Recon Tactical Unit was at the top of his list. He argued that the unit, formed and heavily expanded during Trump's term, represented a dangerous glorification of unchecked military action. Schiff said their missions were opaque, their funding bloated, and their leadership concerningly loyal to a single individual rather than the Constitution. He painted the 3rd Recon as a political weapon disguised as a military necessity. At the time, the media mostly sided with him. Headlines praised his courage to challenge the military-industrial complex. Editorials lauded his commitment to oversight. He became briefly the darling of progressives who believed the military was overstepping its bounds. In their minds, Schiff wasn't just fighting Trump. He was defending democracy from a creeping authoritarian shadow. But in the homes of veterans, especially those who had served in that very unit, the reaction was different. News clips of Schiff's speeches played in VA centers and military households like cold water being poured on open wounds. The 3rd Recon wasn't just a name, it was a lifeline. It was the unit that responded first in Syria when Allied forces were ambushed. It was the unit that pulled out civilians during the Kandahar evacuation. It was the unit that, according to many soldiers, never left anyone behind. To accuse them of being political pawns, that stung. One veteran, Sergeant Andrew Keller, who lost his right leg during a reconnaissance mission in Iraq, gave an interview days later. Eyes full of disbelief, he said, "I wasn't fighting for Trump. I was fighting for the guy next to me." Schiff doesn't know the first thing about what we gave up. The backlash from the military community started as a low hum, but over time, it grew louder. Schiff's office began receiving letters, thousands of them, some handwritten in shaky cursive by Vietnam veterans. Others were typed in anger by Gold Star parents. A few simply included folded flags and the words, "You don't speak for us." Yet Schiff remained firm. He continued to say he was holding the military to account, ensuring America never blurred the lines between honor and political ambition. It was a principled stand until it wasn't. What he underestimated was that in America, you don't get to define patriotism from a congressional hearing room. It lives in the dirt-covered boots, in the folded flags handed to mothers, in the photographs of young faces that never came home. And when those symbols are questioned, even by someone with good intentions, the emotional fallout is unforgiving. Years passed, the hearings ended, the headlines faded, but the resentment remained like an ember, glowing quietly beneath the surface of the public's memory. That's why, when those same soldiers marched down Constitution Avenue during the parade, on those who wore the 3rd Recon patch that Schiff once tried to make disappear, it wasn't just a visual moment. It was the release of years of quiet pain, a rebuttal without words. And that's why the look on Schiff's face that day wasn't just shock. It was the realization that history had remembered everything. Every word, every vote, every dismissal. The emotional damage was done long before the parade began. It was rooted in those early hearings, in the sterile language of oversight that ignored the living, bleeding consequences of service. And now, as that history came roaring back in full-dress uniform, the reckoning had finally begun. Donald Trump had always understood the power of spectacle. But what unfolded on that crisp morning wasn't just theater. It was strategy, pure, calculated strategy. While pundits had dismissed the military parade as another one of Trump's ego displays, what they didn't realize was how meticulously every moment had been crafted. This wasn't about tanks rolling through D.C. for the sake of nostalgia or strength. This was about reclaiming the narrative, about hitting back at years of criticism, congressional investigations, and the political elite who had worked tirelessly to erase everything he had built. And no name was more symbolic of that opposition than Adam Schiff. In Trump's eyes, Schiff was the architect of betrayal. The man who led impeachment proceedings, who sat smugly on television dissecting classified hearings, who used every available microphone to question not only Trump's decisions, but his very legitimacy. Schiff had become the embodiment of the resistance, and the 3rd Recon Tactical Unit had been one of the casualties in that war. So Trump did what he knew best. He set the stage. The parade wasn't announced months in advance. It was revealed only weeks before, giving critics little time to mobilize against it. Leaked details were vague, no clear list of units, no finalized schedule, just enough to create buzz and speculation. And yet, behind the scenes, Trump's team was orchestrating every step. The inclusion of the 3rd Recon Unit wasn't random. It was deliberate. Trump had been in quiet talks with veteran leaders, with the families of fallen soldiers, with retired commanders who had watched in silence as their unit was defunded and shamed. Many of them had felt forgotten, not just by Schiff, but by Washington itself. Trump listened, and then he acted. He approved the decision to have the 3rd Recon lead the symbolic midpoint of the parade. He insisted their flags be carried by the children of the fallen. He demanded that the unit not just march but return in a moment of vindication, a resurrection of honor that Schiff had, in their view, tried to bury. And then came the speech. Trump stood on the viewing platform, flanked by generals, Medal of Honor recipients, and aging veterans in full regalia. He waited until the 3rd Recon passed, waited until the roar of applause reached its peak. Then he stepped forward, leaned into the microphone, and spoke words that were not just patriotic but piercing. They said we didn't need these warriors. They called them dangerous, too bold, too loyal, too American. He paused as the crowd erupted. But I say this, when our enemies were closing in, it wasn't a committee that saved us. It was these brave men and women. It was those they left behind. It was those who still salute even after losing everything. The crowd roared again, some cheering, some crying. A camera caught a young widow nodding, her hand over her heart. Trump continued, quieter now. They tried to erase you. They tried to rewrite your story. But look at this. Look around. America didn't forget, and neither did I. It was political warfare cloaked in patriotism, and it was devastatingly effective. Cable networks scrambled to respond. Even liberal commentators found themselves struggling to criticize the speech without sounding like they were attacking the military. One anchor admitted live on air, "Say what you want about Trump, but he just reminded millions of Americans why they supported him in the first place." Meanwhile, online, the emotional weight of the parade spread like wildfire. Videos of the 3rd Recon marching went viral. A photo of a young boy holding a banner that read, "My dad died in silence. Today, he marches again." Hit 10 million views in under an hour. And through it all, Schiff's name was everywhere, not as a legislator or lawmaker, but as the man who tried to stop it all from happening. As Trump stood tall and smiled at the waves of gratitude from the crowd, he knew exactly what he had done. This wasn't just about honoring the military. This was about reclaiming lost ground, about turning a parade into a moment of justice, about dragging Schiff's past decisions into the light and letting the American people judge for themselves. And the verdict was clear. In that hour, Trump didn't just win over hearts. He lit a fire under a movement that had gone quiet. And Adam Schiff, watching it unfold from a sterile government building across town, could do nothing but witness the tide turning. Again. By the time the parade footage had fully circulated, Adam Schiff knew he had to respond. For nearly 12 hours, he had remained silent. His staff urged restraint. Wait out the news cycle, they said. The story would pass. But it wasn't passing. It was escalating. Fast. Cable news ran the parade highlights on a loop, with commentators openly questioning Schiff's legacy. Conservative outlets branded him the man who disrespected heroes, while even moderate voices asked whether his past actions toward the 3rd Recon Unit had been politically short-sighted. Social media was far more brutal. A trending tweet showed Schiff's face superimposed over the words, "You defunded their honor." And so, under growing pressure, Schiff called a press conference. It was hastily arranged at the Capitol Visitor Center. A podium, a few flags, a scattering of reporters, most expecting a standard political cleanup statement. But what unfolded over the next 10 minutes would become one of the most awkward, painful public moments of Schiff's career. He began by trying to pivot the narrative. "I want to be clear," he said, voice steady but hollow. "My concern has always been about transparency, oversight, and the safety of our armed forces. I've never questioned the courage of our soldiers." The words were polished, but the delivery felt disconnected, cold even. As if he were reciting from memory instead of speaking from the heart, he continued, "Yesterday's parade was, in many ways, a beautiful celebration of service. But let's not confuse a well-produced event with real accountability. Patriotism is not performance." The room was quiet, no applause, no murmurs of approval, just a strange, almost uncomfortable silence. Then came the first protest. From the back of the room, a voice broke through. "You call them political tools. My brother died in that unit." All eyes turned. A middle-aged man in a black leather jacket stood holding a folded photo in one hand and a military pin in the other. Security began to approach him, but Schiff raised a hand to stop them. "I understand your pain," Schiff began. "No, you don't," the man snapped. "You erased him. You called his service unnecessary." Schiff faltered, his face flushed slightly, his eyes flickering as if searching for a prepared response. But there was none, because the answer could undo the years of anger that had now finally surfaced. More voices followed, quiet but forceful. A woman stepped forward holding a sign that read, "My son, 3rd Recon, never forgotten." Another simply wept silently in the second row, tears sliding down her cheeks as she clutched a faded military patch. The press conference was unraveling in real time. Schiff tried to continue. "I believe in the Constitution. I believe in protecting democracy." But the words were now just noise. A reporter finally asked, "Congressman, do you regret your actions toward the 3rd Recon?" There was a long pause, longer than expected. Schiff looked down at the podium, exhaled, and finally said, "I regret that my intentions were misunderstood." It wasn't enough. By the time the event ended, most major outlets had already updated their headlines. Schiff press conference ends in tension. Congressman faces grieving families. Regret, but no apology. Worse still, within an hour of the broadcast, the most damning footage began to spread. It showed Schiff, near the end of his speech, voice cracking as he stumbled over a sentence. A brief tremble in his hands, a pause in his tone. His face, hardened for years by debate, scandal, and hearings, suddenly looked hollow, exposed. A still frame from that exact moment went viral. His eyes were slightly red, his jaw clenched. A caption added by a user read, "Now he knows what silence feels like." He had come to set the record straight. Instead, he walked away looking like a man who'd finally realized the cost of detachment. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, mostly veterans and families. They weren't shouting. They weren't even holding protest signs. They were just standing, holding candles, holding photographs, holding each other. As Schiff exited the building through a side door, a reporter asked him one final question. "What would you say to the families who feel like you dishonored their loved ones?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking. In the days following the emotional implosion of Adam Schiff's press conference, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was undeniable, like the air before a coming storm. For years, Schiff had been untouchable in certain circles, a polished face of resistance, a figure of discipline and order. But now the people who once whispered his name with admiration were silent, and the ones who had felt ignored, vilified, even mocked, especially those in military families, had finally found their voice. And they weren't just speaking anymore. They were organizing. Rallies began to appear overnight, first small, then larger. One was held outside the Capitol building, where over 5,000 veterans, military families, and supporters marched with banners showing the insignia of the 3rd Recon Tactical Unit. Some wore uniforms, some wore shirts with the faces of lost loved ones, but most just wore something simple, a patch that read, "We remember what they forgot." The national conversation had turned. Networks that usually avoided anything resembling praise for Trump now hesitated. Editorial boards debated how to walk the line, how to condemn Trump's politics without alienating a growing wave of Americans who felt, for the first time in years, that someone had finally honored their pain. Even Schiff's colleagues grew distant. Democratic leadership offered no full-throated defense. A few issued vague statements about supporting our troops and respecting the role of oversight, but none directly came to Schiff's aid. Behind closed doors, some were furious. Not because of what Trump had done, but because Schiff's original defunding campaign had now come back to haunt them all. He should have let it go, one unnamed senator told a journalist off the record. That unit wasn't the hill to die on. Now we're all bleeding for it. But the most shocking blow came not from Washington, but from within Schiff's district. In California's 30th Congressional District, a previously unknown veteran named Marcus Hill, a former member of the 3rd Recon, announced he would run against Schiff in the upcoming election. He launched his campaign with a single video, standing in front of a row of military gravestones. His voice was calm, sincere, deadly honest. Adam Schiff called our service unnecessary. He treated us like shadows. But we weren't shadows. We were sons, fathers, brothers. And if Washington won't remember that, we'll remind them. Within 48 hours, the video had 22 million views. Donations flooded in. Endorsements from national veterans groups followed. Suddenly, Schiff, once considered a guaranteed win, was now facing a serious, emotional, and high-profile challenge that no one saw coming. And Trump? He stayed silent. Not a tweet, not a statement, nothing. It was the silence of a man who knew he didn't need to say anything. The story was already alive. The people were telling him. And then came the final blow. A new documentary special aired on primetime television, produced not by a conservative outlet, but by a centrist, independent network known for its balanced reporting. It was titled, "The Unit They Tried to Forget." The film walked viewers through the creation of the 3rd Recon Tactical Unit, their missions, their sacrifices, and ultimately, their disbanding, highlighting Schiff's role in pushing the funding cuts. But the most devastating part was saved for the end. The final 10 minutes featured interviews with the families of fallen soldiers, some speaking for the first time. One mother, her hands shaking as she held her son's folded flag, said softly, "We were told his unit wasn't necessary, but to me, he was everything." The screen faded to black. Within an hour, Yak Forgotten But Not Gone was trending globally, and somewhere in a quiet office in D.C., Adam Schiff watched it all unfold. The man who once commanded hearings with steely confidence, who led televised interrogations and fought wars with words, now sat surrounded by silence, his reputation unraveling, not with a scandal, but with a single question echoing across the country. What kind of leader forgets the ones who gave everything? The answer wasn't printed in newspapers or spoken by pundits. It was written in the eyes of a nation that had finally remembered. The final act wasn't delivered in a courtroom, on the floor of Congress, or even during an election debate. It came fittingly during a funeral. Staff Sergeant Miguel Ramirez had died 12 years earlier on a mission deep inside Syrian territory, part of a 3rd Recon extraction team. At the time, his name was honored in military circles, but barely noticed in political ones. There was no public ceremony, no network coverage, just a flag handed to his wife, a folded letter from the Pentagon, and silence. But after everything that had happened, the parade, the backlash against Schiff, the resurrection of national memory, his family decided it was time. They wanted to re-enter Miguel at Arlington National Cemetery in full honors as recognition of the role he played, not just in his mission, but in symbolizing a forgotten group of heroes. Word spread quickly. By the morning of the ceremony, thousands of people lined the walkways. Veterans arrived from every corner of the country. Some limped on canes, others rolled in wheelchairs. Many carried patches from 3rd Recon. A few held handmade signs. Honor delayed is still honor. And, Miguel, we remember. Then as the flag-draped casket approached, something unexpected happened. Donald Trump emerged. He hadn't made a public appearance in weeks. Rumors swirled that he was staying out of the spotlight, letting the emotional wave build naturally. But on that morning, there he was, not as a politician, but as a former commander-in-chief. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He just stood near the family, hand over heart, silent. Reporters whispered to each other. Cameramen hesitated, unsure whether to film. But the crowd already knew. This wasn't a media moment. This was the end of something deeper. After the ceremony, Trump quietly approached Miguel's mother, bent slightly and handed her a single military patch. It was the insignia of 3rd Recon, the original one, the one worn during the unit's most dangerous years. No words were exchanged. None were needed. She simply nodded, eyes wet, lips trembling. And just like that, the circle was complete. Across the country, the imagery from the funeral flooded every screen. Schiff, once again, was nowhere to be found. Not invited, not welcomed, not even mentioned. His silence was deafening. A special session of Congress was called a week later, one pushed forward by a bipartisan group of lawmakers to establish a national day of remembrance for disbanded military units whose service had been politically erased or downplayed. The bill was called The emotional weight of the Third Recon controversy had done more than any political ad or debate ever could. It revealed the moral divide not between right and left, but between those who saw service as sacred and those who treated it as expendable. By the time the election season kicked into full gear, Schiff had become a symbol, not of justice or oversight, but of cold detachment. His speeches fell flat. His interviews grew fewer. His staff, once aggressive defenders, now worked in quiet, desperate damage control. But it was too late. The people had already decided, not just on policies, not just on personalities, but on something deeper. They had chosen memory over manipulation, gratitude over pride, and honor over politics. In the end, Schiff wasn't brought down by scandal or defeat at the polls. He was brought down by something far more damning, a parade of heroes he tried to erase, and a nation that refused to forget. Months later, the election loomed. Debates raged on across the country about the economy, immigration, the courts, but in quiet diners, small-town churches, VFW halls, and city sidewalks, one story still lingered. One image still echoed louder than any campaign ad or political slogan. The moment the Third Recon marched again. It had become more than a moment. It had become a movement, and its ripple effect was now undeniable. Adam Schiff, once considered untouchable in California's 30th congressional district, now stood on the verge of losing everything. His challenger, Marcus Hill, the quiet, composed former 3rd Recon veteran, had surged in the polls. Hill didn't spend his time attacking. He didn't call Schiff a traitor or a fraud. Instead, he talked about honor, about memory, about the cost of silence. His rallies felt less like political events and more like memorials, attended by Gold Star families, veterans, and everyday Americans who felt for the first time in years that someone was speaking for them, not at them. Election day arrived. The national spotlight wasn't on the presidency that morning. It wasn't in the Senate. It was on a single congressional race, one that symbolized far more than just a district. The numbers came in slowly at first. Early projections had Schiff slightly ahead. But as more ballots were counted, especially those from military-heavy neighborhoods and longtime Democratic families who had shifted, the tide turned. By midnight, Marcus Hill stood on stage before an ocean of supporters. His voice cracked as he said, "This wasn't my victory, it was theirs, the ones who never got to come home." Adam Schiff released a brief statement the next morning. It read like a formality, no speech, no cameras. Just a typed message posted to his website, thanking his supporters and acknowledging his defeat. But behind the scenes, it was something else entirely. Sources close to his staff described a man hollowed out, still going through the motions, still answering emails, still showing up to meetings, but without spark, without conviction. The man who once launched investigations, who battled a sitting president with relentless focus, had been publicly dismantled not by scandal, not by evidence, but by a story he couldn't control, a story he didn't write, and that story only continued to grow. Congress, in a rare show of unity, passed the Recon Restoration Act, a bill that restored funding and full honor to the 3rd Recon Tactical Unit. It ensured their legacy would be taught in military academies, and a memorial would be erected at Arlington, a towering, solemn sculpture of a lone soldier, standing watch with his hand on a folded flag. The dedication ceremony was attended by tens of thousands. Former presidents, both Democrat and Republican, came. Veterans across generations stood shoulder to shoulder. Mothers cried. Children asked questions. And among the crowd, without press or entourage, Donald Trump appeared once again, standing quietly, hand over heart, facing the monument. No speech, just presence. And with that, the final chapter in the long, painful saga of the Third Recon was sealed. Not with bitterness or vengeance, but with vindication. In the end, Schiff didn't disappear from public life completely. He took a fellowship at a university, taught courses on constitutional law, and occasionally appeared in interviews. But he never again held elected office. His name, once spoken with reverence or rage, had become a cautionary tale in political circles, a warning about what happens when the pursuit of power forgets the price of sacrifice. The emotional weight of the Third Recon controversy had done more than any political ad or debate ever could. It revealed the moral divide not between right and left, but between those who saw service as sacred and those who treated it as expendable. By the time the election season kicked into full gear, Schiff had become a symbol, not of justice or oversight, but of cold detachment. His speeches fell flat. His interviews grew fewer. His staff, once aggressive defenders, now worked in quiet, desperate damage control. But it was too late. The people had already decided, not just on policies, not just on personalities, but on something deeper. They had chosen memory over manipulation, gratitude over pride, and honor over politics. In the end, Schiff wasn't brought down by scandal or defeat at the polls. He was brought down by something far more damning, a parade of heroes he tried to erase, and a nation that refused to forget. Months later, the election loomed. Debates raged on across the country about the economy, immigration, the courts, but in quiet diners, small-town churches, VFW halls, and city sidewalks, one story still lingered. One image still echoed louder than any campaign ad or political slogan. The moment the Third Recon marched again. It had become more than a moment. It had become a movement, and its ripple effect was now undeniable. Adam Schiff, once considered untouchable in California's 30th congressional district, now stood on the verge of losing everything. His challenger, Marcus Hill, the quiet, composed former Third Recon veteran, had surged in the polls. Hill didn't spend his time attacking. He didn't call Schiff a traitor or a fraud. Instead, he talked about honor, about memory, about the cost of silence. His rallies felt less like political events and more like memorials, attended by Gold Star families, veterans, and everyday Americans who felt for the first time in years that someone was speaking for them, not at them. Election day arrived. The national spotlight wasn't on the presidency that morning. It wasn't in the Senate. It was on a single congressional race, one that symbolized far more than just a district. The numbers came in slowly at first. Early projections had Schiff slightly ahead. But as more ballots were counted, especially those from military-heavy neighborhoods and longtime Democratic families who had shifted, the tide turned. By midnight, Marcus Hill stood on stage before an ocean of supporters. His voice cracked as he said, "This wasn't my victory, it was theirs, the ones who never got to come home." Adam Schiff released a brief statement the next morning. It read like a formality, no speech, no cameras. Just a typed message posted to his website, thanking his supporters and acknowledging his defeat. But behind the scenes, it was something else entirely. Sources close to his staff described a man hollowed out, still going through the motions, still answering emails, still showing up to meetings, but without spark, without conviction. The man who once launched investigations, who battled a sitting president with relentless focus, had been publicly dismantled not by scandal, not by evidence, but by a story he couldn't control, a story he didn't write, and that story only continued to grow. Congress, in a rare show of unity, passed the Recon Restoration Act, a bill that restored funding and full honor to the 3rd Recon Tactical Unit. It ensured their legacy would be taught in military academies, and a memorial would be erected at Arlington, a towering, solemn sculpture of a lone soldier, standing watch with his hand on a folded flag. The dedication ceremony was attended by tens of thousands. Former presidents, both Democrat and Republican, came. Veterans across generations stood shoulder to shoulder. Mothers cried. Children asked questions. And among the crowd, without press or entourage, Donald Trump appeared once again, standing quietly, hand over heart, facing the monument. No speech, just presence. And with that, the final chapter in the long, painful saga of the Third Recon was sealed. Not with bitterness or vengeance, but with vindication. In the end, Schiff didn't disappear from public life completely. He took a fellowship at a university, taught courses on constitutional law, and occasionally appeared in interviews. But he never again held elected office. His name, once spoken with reverence or rage, had become a cautionary tale in political circles, a warning about what happens when the pursuit of power forgets the price of sacrifice.